This podcast is brought to you by Squarespace. Hey guys, welcome back to the Brooklyn PhotoWorks ISO 320 podcast. This is episode 2, and this podcast has been developing actually pretty quickly. This episode is really exciting because not only is it Daniel and myself, but we've also added a third photographer, a good friend of mine, Marc Holstein, hailing from Germany. I should just try not to pronounce his name with an accent because I'm terrible with accents. So Marc Holstein from Germany is jumping on this podcast, and it's really exciting. In this podcast, we talk about the love of shooting film. We all love shooting film. I actually grew up shooting film, and even in college, I had a black and white darkroom where I learned how to do everything from processing and enlarging and printing and the whole deal. And that was, kind of like a formative part of my photography career. Then I guess, people like Daniel and Mark, they became enthusiasts because, shooting film is no longer a ubiquitous thing. It's really kind of an enthusiast thing. It's like listening and collecting, vinyl records. Bands are still putting out vinyl, but it's really just, a smaller segment. However, that segment is ravenous and excited, and it still exists. And the same thing is true for film. There's just something about film that does not, or there's just something about film that looks like nothing else. There's a certain kind of density to it. There's a saturation, there's colors, there's all kinds of wonderful things about film that we all seem to agree on, and we all seem to have a very similar kind of idea about it, although we shoot different stuff. We shoot different cameras. The cool thing about film is that when you shoot film, it kind of bakes a certain look into the photos, and you kind of know that going in. Like, that if you're going to be shooting with Portra, that you're going to get a very distinct kind of a look when you're shooting with Portra, whereas if you're shooting with Ektar or Ektachrome, whatever. And the same thing holds true for shooting black and white. Unlike when you're shooting digitally, your camera is going to influence the look of what you're shooting to some degree, but then you can take it into post and you can really kind of take it into a whole slew of different directions. You can give it a vintage look, a modern look, you can do a black and white, conversion, whatever it may be. Whereas shooting film, you're kind of like locked into that. And that's kind of, interesting and fun. And I think that there's a whole romanticism that exists about shooting film because you slow everything down. Your mind slows down, the process slows down. There's no instant gratification. There's no chimping on the back of the camera. You have to wind it. Well, not every camera, but a lot of the cameras we're using, you have to wind it, for each exposure. You're only limited to 12 or 24, maybe 36 exposures. So there's an economy. There's a whole different mentality when you're shooting film, and we all really seem to appreciate that, or definitely appreciate that. And that is what this podcast is dedicated to. We talked for a while. We probably could have gone on for a whole lot longer. This podcast, weighs in a little over an hour, but I'm sure we could have gone on for hours. So we left a lot of meat, on the bone, so that we can come back, circle back, and definitely revisit this topic again and again. Like I've said in the past, this podcast is a work in progress. So, number one, we hope that you will subscribe to this podcast. We hope that you'll follow all of us on Instagram. Certainly would love it if you followed me on YouTube. We welcome your comments and your suggestions. So that's it. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in.